Om Namah Shivaya Shantaya Karanatraya Hetave Nivedayami Chatmanam Gatistvam Parameshwaraha Om Bhur Bhuvaswaha Tat Saviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yanah Prachodayat Om Aghorebhyo Taghorebhyo Ghora Ghora Taribhya Sarvatah Sarva Sarvebhyo Namaste Rudra Rupebhya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, I salute all the forms of Bhairava. Om, peace, peace, peace. So, tonight's lecture, it's going to be a continuation in some sense from last week's talk on the self that inheres in all beings. So we just covered Vijñāna-Bhairava verse 100, and it begs the question, a very important question, what is the self actually? Because the verse is all about the self. It makes a claim about the self being inherent in all beings as all beings. But we have to articulate very carefully what we mean by the self. In what sense is the self all pervasively present in all beings as all beings? Which self? Because in our experience, there seem to be at least 4 or 5 different selves that we can experience at any given time. The first concept of the self is as the other. So we feel ourselves to be in our relationships and in our possessions and in our roles, if you will. So I am a high court judge, or I am a wife, or I am a mother, or I am an executive, or something like that. There are all these roles that we play, and those roles are in relation to some external person or place or situation. So the self can be conceived as an externality, as an object. And so many of us feel ourselves to be our things. So I am my car, or I am my house, or something like that. Especially in this country, there's a strong sense in which who you are as a person is attributed to what you own, how much your bank account is, or something like that. So that sense of self is, of course, very, very, let's say, disheartening, because it seems to be not the point. It arguably misses the point. There's a feeling that this is not really me. And so people who pursue wealth and feel like they're going to find themselves through pursuing wealth, or who want a big house or want a big car, or who want fame or something, or who want to be a CEO or somebody respectable, they get to the end of that journey and they feel further away from themselves than ever before. That's the blessing of living life truly and gregariously, because what we're really doing is we're trying to articulate a sense of self, and we first try to do it through things and through people, basically through externality. That's the first sense of self that we have. So you could say this is the false sense of self, or the projected sense of self. In fact, it's the person that I think I am on Instagram, or the person that I think I am to my friends, or to my partner, or to my family. So this kind of self is very situational and circumstantial. That's why a person can feel like different people in different settings, depending on the setting and depending on the person that they're with, and depending on the things that they own also. So all of these are various permutations of the projected externalized self. So there's that self. We can call this maybe, usually when we use the word ego, this is what we have in mind, right? The ego is the false self, the persona that we put on when we interact with the world. But here, the Sanskrit word ahankara is much deeper. It doesn't imply this social self or external self. I think we'll just call this the projection, or the externalized sense of self. The least me that I can be, and yet I still feel myself to be something of this. Then there's a deeper sense of self, and this, properly speaking, is called the ego. So the second sense of self is known as ahankara. So the ahankara is the one who is the agent of all cognitions and actions. So the ahankara is the one who sees through the eyes, hears through the ears, tastes through the tongue, smells through the nose, feels through the skin. It's the one who walks through the feet, grabs through the hands, evacuates through the anus, reproduces through the genitals, and speaks through the mouth. It's the one who thinks and who reasons and who remembers. That one is called ahankara. And you're like, oh my God, that sounds like the self, the Atman. Does it not? No, that is the creation of the Atman as the actor and cognizer of the world, of the external projected world. So this is where we get a very refined and very important nuance. When people study Advaita and they say, I am God, often that statement is misattributed to the ahankara, the fabricated sense of self. And I don't mean fabricated in the sense of projected or externalized. That's the first category. We've already talked about that. I'm talking about something even deeper. Here, it's fabricated in the sense that it's a projection of the Purusha, or the Atman, if you will, if I can use the word projection at all here, which allows the Purusha to cognize and to act. So this is very delicate what we're saying here. So as long as there is some external object to be cognized, there must be a cognizer. So ahankara only exists. This is maybe a key to meditation, if you will. The cognizer only exists with respect to some kind of cognition. So if there is no taste of chai, there is no taster of the chai either. So there must be the taste of chai for there to be the taster of the chai. So the taster of the chai, that ahankara, is a cognizer that was created. That's why the word kara, ahankara, the creation of the I sense, it was created with respect to that which it wants to cognize now, with respect to the chai. That's a delicate idea. Now, if there's nothing to taste or see or hear or smell, if there's nothing to do, there will be no ahankara. So the ahankara, it emerges spontaneously, if you will, and maybe not so spontaneously because it's conditioned. It emerges conditioned by what it's emerging to interact with. That's called the ahankara. So that's the second sense of self that we have to deal with in today's lecture. The third sense of self is the Purusha. The Purusha is what you might otherwise call the Atman, the self. Now that Purusha is distinct from the ahankara. And the ahankara is distinct from the projected superficial social self, if you will. Now, what is the relationship between the superficial self to the ahankara, the ego? And what is the relationship between the ego, the ahankara, and the Purusha, the indweller or the Atman, if you will? And what is the relationship, and here's where it gets really deep, between the Atman and what the yogis call Paramatman or Bhagavan or Brahman? So the word Brahman can be used interchangeably with Paramatman in some senses. And it can also in some sense be used interchangeably with Bhagavan, the all. The word Brahman from the Sanskrit root Bri just means the vast. And the vast here is what we mean when we say Bhagavan. So impersonality, personality aside, nirguna, saguna aside, let's put those technical philosophical terms aside for now. This just refers to the oversoul or the one reality. Is the Atman synonymous with that reality? As indeed is the claim of Advaita Vedanta, Atman is Brahman. That's what Advaita Vedanta says. Or is the individual self a part of that absolute reality, as Ramanuja suggests? So the self is one part, and the whole is the sum total of all those parts. So and more. God is the sum total of all souls and something more, even beyond that. So is it a part to whole relationship, or are they distinct? Is the Atman, the Purusha, the self, distinct from Shiva, distinct from Bhagavan, distinct from Brahman? In what way are they distinct? These are all questions worth asking when we investigate the self. And another question worth asking, a very important question worth asking is there even such a thing? This is where it gets really beautiful. And this is the Buddhist claim. There is no self, anatman. There is no ego. And there is no Atman either. There is no Purusha, there is no Ahankara, there is no Brahman also, there is no Bhagavan, there is no God, and so there is no soul. The soul has no relationship to God because neither of those things exist in and of themselves. So the Buddhist challenge to quote-unquote dharmic traditions or Vedic traditions is a challenge to the self. Everybody in the Vedic world believes in the self or asserts a self. Nyayikas, Vaisheshikas, Sāmkhyans, yogis, Mimamsikas, Vedantists, all of them say there is a self. Not all of them say there's Bhagavan. So Advaita Vedanta agrees in a sense with Buddhism that there is no personal God. But they disagree with Buddhism in the sense that they say there is an ultimate reality. Buddhism won't say there is an ultimate reality, nor will it deny one either, but that's a story for another day. For now, it's important to remember that Buddhism outright rejects the self. And there are important arguments that we get from Buddhism against the concept of the self. And there are also arguments from Buddhism against the concept of God. And those same arguments appear also within the Vedic tradition as well, against different conceptions of God. See, Advaita Vedanta is comfortable using seemingly Buddhistic arguments to defeat the idea of a personal God in order to propose an impersonal Nirguna Brahman absolute instead. So these arguments for the self and against the self ought to be investigated. Arguments for God and against God also should be investigated. All of these are wonderful, meaningful discussions to have. But today we're not going to focus on God so much. We're going to focus on the self. And what I want to do, Ma willing, is I want to track the development of the self, if you will, through these various different traditions and just argue for it and hopefully lead us to the realization that the Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra wants us to have about the self. And so let's just look at that verse right up at the top of the lecture. Let's just see what the Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra proposes with regard to the self. So here we go. As you can see, it says, Chid dharma sarva deheshu vishesho nasti kutrachit. So there's a na-asti statement here. There's a claim being made that there is no such thing, or there does not exist vishesho kutrachit. So there is no such thing as a discrete, individual, special consciousness. So there is no such thing as the individual self. The verse says that. Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra verse 100 denies the existence of an individual self. It just outright says it. Vishesho nasti kutrachit. There is not discrete knowers. There is not separate subjective selves, if you will, which already takes it away from Sāmkhya, it takes it away from yoga, takes it away from Ramanuja, takes it even away from Shaiva Siddhānta and the earlier dualistic forms of the tradition. So this is quite the claim. Now it sounds quite Buddhistic, doesn't it? Because it's like a Buddhistic claim that there's no self. And that's what they're saying. They're saying there's no special self. But there is one reality. And so the Buddhist won't say this. The Buddhists will imply it, but they will not actually out and out say that there is a reality, unless you're a Prasangika Madhyamika, or what do they call them? The Shentong interpretation. In Tibet, there was a movement. Actually, they were actually killed. A lot of their monasteries were destroyed and burnt to the ground. But that Shentong Madhyamika movement, they were willing to say that there is such a thing called the clear light of the void or something like that. But for traditional Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, there is no absolute reality. Here, it's a claim that there is one reality. And that reality is essentially consciousness. Chid dharma, the attribute, the essence of that reality, dharma, is chid, consciousness. And sarva deheshu, and it is in everybody. So this one reality is the one reality in all bodies, and that there is no special consciousness anywhere. This is the claim from the Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra. And thus, atascha, and thus, a person who contemplates, bhavayan, a person who thinks about this, contemplates this, meditates on this, and meditates on the fact that this entire world is that reality called consciousness. Tanmayam sarvam. That person conquers the world or goes beyond the wheel of birth and death. In other words, that person is liberated. That person is free. So in verse 100, we get an upaya, a technique. And I told you last week that this is Shakta Upaya. It's the way of Shakti, meaning this type of spiritual practice is a contemplative practice. It's not a mantra japa practice. You don't have to repeat any kind of mantra. It's not any kind of visualization. You don't have to visualize chakras or any kind of deity. You merely have to think about it, contemplate it, reason it out. And through your intellectual inquiry into this truth, you will have a spontaneous intuitive realization. So I said last week, this is an important point, Shakta Upaya becomes Shambhava Upaya. It doesn't have to be, but it can be Shambhava Upaya also. Shambhava Upaya means intuitive understanding. You'll just intuit the truth of this statement by intellectually cogitating on it. So now what do we have to do? Simply we have to take this sentence. There is one reality whose essential nature is consciousness, and this is in everybody. There is no special consciousness anywhere. That's it. That's the sentence. And we just have to think about that. A person who contemplates this and who contemplates that the entire world is pervaded by this, thus conquers the world. So let's take that sentence one more time. Chid dharma sarvadeheshu vishesho nasti kutrachit. There is one reality only whose essential nature is consciousness. And this is in everybody. There is no special consciousness anywhere. Okay. Beautiful. You could just have that on a bumper sticker or something, I don't know, and somebody behind you in the traffic might be enlightened. Might be dangerous for driving though. They might go into samadhi and then they won't drive and the traffic will be held up. Maybe that's why LA traffic is so bad. People are going into samadhi, I don't know. But it's also good to just have it like written down somewhere, and then you can just look at it and think about it, contemplate it. That's how this practice is supposed to go. So let's do it now. We're gonna engage together in this practice of contemplation. Let's start with this. And the kind of inquiry that I'm going to do today is a bit comparative in nature. I want to compare this claim to other schools, namely the Buddhistic school and the dualistic Shaiva school, Shaiva Siddhānta school. So we're going to do this kind of comparative survey of the notion of the self, a kind of cross-reference, a comparative study, and that's going to be our contemplation. Okay, we'll start with this. There is only one reality whose essential nature is consciousness. Already, Sāmkhya will disagree. We know the Sāmkhyan position is as follows. There are two realities. There's Prakriti and there's Purusha. Purusha is the individual self, the perceiver, the conscious subject. And Prakriti is the world of objects that can be perceived, conceived, and interacted with by that inherently transcendent, ever-free Purusha. So these two categories always exist. Now, when you look at Sāmkhya and its conception of Prakriti, you get what looks like an evolutionary theory, a Darwinism almost, dare I say it. Not quite, but something like it. So according to Sāmkhya, Prakriti is inert. And according to modern science, this world is also inert. Matter is inert. There's no consciousness in matter, you see. There are conscious beings that are made of matter, but matter itself is not inherently conscious. Now, there's a new view that's very popular these days. It's called panpsychism. It's the idea that matter is conscious, that everything exists within as consciousness even. So it's like a more modern view, and it's obviously echoing the certain views in Eastern traditions. But Sāmkhya is very much prima facie like materialism, at least with regards to Prakriti. So it says that this world is inherently jara, meaning inert, and matter itself, it just evolves of its own volition without being acted upon by any external cause. That sounds very much like Buddhist and materialist logic. You don't need God to explain the world because the world explains itself. So the Buddhist logic is every cause has an effect, and every effect is also a cause. And this entire world is one self-contained series of causes and effects. You don't need some cause outside of the world that can act as a prima mobile or a prime mover for the world. The world is sufficient an explanation unto itself. You can explain the world in terms of the world. You don't need to look for some like extra terrestrial, to use the literal word here. You don't have to look for some extra being, supernatural being. The world, it's sufficient. It's natural, and the explanations are also natural. So Sāmkhya, way before the materialist and the Darwinist of our day and age, they already made this argument that it's just a big bang. Like at some point, all of matter is condensed into a single point. This is called the Mahalaya, and in this point, the three gunas of Prakriti, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, or the three energies, are in perfect equilibrium. So this is what a modern quantum mechanic expert might call, quantum mechanics master might call, I use the word master, but yes, a master of quantum mechanics might call this quantum flux or quantum foam. These are new words in the science that they're using to describe this state of equilibrium before the Big Bang. So in the beginning, quote unquote, there was not the word, for there was not God. There was only the perfect stasis, the perfect equilibrium of these three primordial energies, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And then something happened. And you know what? It doesn't need anything else to explain. It just happened. And this is called the Big Bang, which here is the disequilibration of the three gunas. And once that Big Bang happened, suddenly you have this expansion of evolution. And so you get all these various properties, buddhi, manas, ahankara, buddhi, ahankara, manas, and then the five organs of perception, the five organs of action, the subtle world, and the physical world. Of course, this is all there in Sāmkhya. I don't think the Big Bang theory or the materialist or the Darwinist will say that mind or intellect or ego or the sense organs are an evolution of the Big Bang. You know, but in a sense, they do say that. In a sense, because in a sense, the matter comes first, and then from the matter emerges sense organs and whatnot. And so consciousness is emergent. Matter first. Big Bang is just matter condensed, and then poof, the matter expands, and then all these planets form, and then yeah, we're still the Big Bang banging on, if you will. And then there's this series of evolutionary events that create more and more refined nervous systems, and eventually a particular nervous system with a particular kind of brain. It doesn't even really need to have a central nervous system. It can even just have a peripheral, something like that. But like whatever, even the most basic, like invertebrate kind of thing, something happens. they become conscious. And it's inexplicable how the inert matter becomes a conscious perceiving entity. But the general assumption is that there's matter, and then from matter comes consciousness. Good, I'm happy you're enjoying it. It's my beloved upaya also, Shakta upaya, to reason out, to contemplate, to be a philosopher. It's nice. So this is the view of materialism. Consciousness evolves from matter. This is where Sāmkhya parts ways with the materialist. The materialist will say, there's Big Bang. There's not necessarily any God or anything like that. It's just nature is causes and effects all bound up together, and there was this like Big Bang, and then a series of causes and effects occurred, and then through billions of years of variation, and of course mutation also, mutation, variation, and because of that natural selection over billions of years of this kind of process, we get planets, and in some planets there's life maybe, and that life evolves over billions and billions of years, and then finally it becomes complex life, and that complex life is therefore able to reason and think and go on Reddit and argue with Buddhists or something like that, but it's all part of evolution. And so evolution is the theory that explains how matter becomes consciousness. But the assumption here is that matter produces consciousness. Okay, we can push back against this view in a few ways. Firstly, you cannot say that matter produces consciousness because you cannot really even say what matter is. That's the first argument against materialism. See, materialism is the view that matter is the ultimate reality. The first problem with materialism is that nobody knows what the fuck matter is even. So it used to be that matter was like just things. Aristotle made that argument. A tree, a rock, these are substances. They're just things. And these things are the basic building blocks of reality. And then, Dalton and people like that were looking for something even more basic than a rock and a tree, and they found this atom, or not found, proposed an atom. Interestingly, Dalton proposes an atom hundreds of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of years after the early Shaivas did. So the Vaisheshikas proposed the Anu, the atom, way before the the Dalton movement would propose it. So the idea of an atom is already known, and in ancient Greece there was also Democritus also proposed the idea of an atom. So the idea that there's a basic building block for matter, namely the atom, was there in the ancient Greeks with Democritus. It was there in the ancient Indians as well. Probably there with the ancient aliens. Whenever I say the word ancient, I see that guy from Ancient Aliens with the crazy hair, and he's like, and I'm like, wait, we're doing that right now. No, I'm kidding. So, there was this idea of the atom was actually quite old. The only difference is that Dalton used modern scientific methods to show it or to prove it. So he did some experiments with some models in front of the Royal Society in England and whatnot, and they were like, oh yeah, there are atoms. And then later, when the instruments got more sophisticated, people like Ernest Rutherford could then like shoot alpha particles or something like that at a sheet of gold or a sheet of, I think it was tin or something like that. He was shooting particles at matter. And he was surprised to find, eerily, most of these particles were going straight through the matter as if it didn't matter. Yeah, it was gold foil, right? Like some very thin, very subtle form of matter. And these particles, these alpha particles or whatever that he was shooting, was just going through the matter as if it didn't matter. And that's kind of concerning. It's like there's no stuff there. Nothing is deflecting. And so he, it was very dangerous. He almost got to the point of like discarding the theory of atoms and matter altogether, which I think would have been a step up. But anyway, thankfully for them, they found a deflection. A lab assistant found it, I think. So by chance, they realized, no, there is a deflection. Therefore, there must be some matter there. But it's not like what Dalton proposed. It's not like a discrete ball. Rather, it's like a nucleus. And in that nucleus is where all the matter is. And so the matter is mostly just empty space with a nucleus in the middle. And now it becomes really mysterious. How is it that empty space has this much solidity? And then we get the idea of protons, neutrons, and of course the electrons. So now around this empty space are orbitals. And now we start getting quantum with it. Now we get people like Niels Bohr and whatnot. The early 1900s quantum mechanics, like during the time of Hitler's regime and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a race for nuclear power and all these things happening. And Niels Bohr proposes this orbital theory, which is not taken too seriously today. Today, it's a probability cloud theory. So it's called bicycle theory or something like that. So it's a probability cloud. So the electron is everywhere and nowhere at once. But there is this center, nucleus, which has protons and neutrons, and around it is like a sort of self-contained circuit of an electron cloud. And that's what makes an atom. And then these interact with other atoms, and those clouds can like bind in a p way and an s way, and this explains how all the discrete atoms combine to make compounds and then combine to form even more complex things. But the problem is, today there are further and further subdivisions of that neutron and proton. So now we're finding like quarks or something like that, like smaller and smaller things. So this argument was made long ago by the Buddhist. In fact, it appears in the Svabodhodaya Manjari. Matter can be subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided until what you get is an infinite regress. So this is an argument against matter. You find that argument as early as the first Buddhist thinkers, even earlier than that also. In the Upanishads, you find arguments against matter. But the important thing is this is theoretical and experimental physics, both of them confirming what by logic we in the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions have argued out. So there is no matter because it can be continuously subdivided. And so you get string theory, and then that's debunked, and then all these discussions about matter, they're very important because the experts don't really know what it is. They have theories about it, but they can't really pinpoint what matter is. This is what Strawson, the philosopher, calls the hard problem of matter. It's a joke, actually, because there's the question, the hard problem of consciousness. How does matter become conscious? But Strawson the younger, he says, well, that's not really a hard problem at all. Consciousness is obvious and immediate and self-evident. The real problem is matter. We take matter to be a given, but actually it's mysterious how empty space appears to be so solid. It's actually a mirage. This matter that we see around us, modern science tells us that we're seeing incorrectly. It's a mirage. Actually, all of this. Nothing matters as much as we think it does. If you don't mind me saying that. So that's the first argument against matter. The second argument is against evolutionary theory. So the argument here is that things gain complexity as they evolve over billions and billions of years. The first problem with that, though, is as follows. Things come with a lot of complexity from the get-go. So it's not that things come in a simple way and then over billions of years develop into complexity. Rather, those things themselves, those basic building blocks which are supposed to be simple, when carefully analyzed, display tremendous complexity. So a simple virus or something, it's not even life by our standards, but it's already so complex. Or bacteria, unicellular protoplasm of something, like, oh my god, like it's already so complex to begin with. So if you say complexity comes from basic simple building blocks, you're in trouble because the building blocks come with an inbuilt complexity already. And the second problem is, because of the tremendous complexity that we see in the world, we have no way of actually saying that we had enough time for this complexity to develop. I think that's a thinner argument, because who knows how much time it takes anyway for things to become complex. But it's an argument that's offered against evolutionary theories, that it would take too long to create this amount of complexity, and clearly the things in and of themselves are already complex. So how can you argue for complexity emerging from simplicity? So that's the second argument against evolution. The third argument is, at what point does this animating principle come? How does seemingly inert matter suddenly become life? Now, life has been studied thoroughly. We know quite a lot about life because it's an object that science can properly study. Science being the study of objects. So obviously it can study life quite well, but it cannot point to how an inert thing becomes a living thing. It can study the living thing and it can study the inert thing, but it cannot say anything about the gap or the moment when the gap is transcended. So when do 20 or so proteins in a petri dish become a unicellular organism? What is that animating principle? So this is an argument for God, because that first conception of God is the animator, the one that breathes life, if you will, into the clay image of Adam. So the metaphorical language of the Bible, and of course the Puranic language that we get, that Puranic kind of God breathes life into things language, which we find in ancient Egypt and everywhere. It's the idea that there's some animating principle. And this anima mundi, the soul of the world, which is God in one sense, is the one that breathes life into the otherwise inert world. Evolutionary science or materialism has no explanation for how an inert thing becomes animated, or at least not any that I know of as yet. But the even deeper question that we have to ask, an even more problematic question, is what about consciousness? Never mind life, like the animating of life. What about consciousness? At what point does matter generate consciousness? Because in materialism, the argument is that the brain produces consciousness. Consciousness is an epiphenomenon, if you will. It arises from electrical and chemical reactions in the brain. Except correlation is not at all causation. And so we can't say that these electrical firings in the brain correspond to consciousness. And we can't even say it correlates to consciousness either. Up till now, we used to think that the brain correlated with consciousness, because when you change the brain, you change your experience. But up till now, we haven't had in Western science and psychology and philosophy a clear working definition of consciousness. So people like Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers have, of course, these days popularized a really concise and beautiful definition for consciousness. Consciousness is what it feels like to be a thing. It's the first person subjective experiencer. It is not the experiences which it is having. So the experiences are correlated to the brain. If you change the brain, you change what memories you can remember. If you change the brain, you change your personality, like in the case of Phineas Gage. But that doesn't say anything about consciousness. The same consciousness that was aware of the memory is now aware of the memory loss. What has changed is the content, the memory, not the perceiving unit of subjectivity. Do you see? Without a definition of consciousness, Western psychology, philosophy, and science was happy to define consciousness as thoughts and emotions and experiences. And of course, the brain, as the hardware, as the physical apparatus for those things, is correlated to those things. However, and this is so brilliant, however, those things, thoughts, emotions, memories, projections, they aren't consciousness. They are the contents of consciousness, the objects of consciousness. Isn't that a beautiful idea? And this is what Sāmkhya intuited from the very beginning. It's one of the earliest schools of Indian philosophy. Now, mind you, it takes hundreds of years of Cartesian confusion, if I may put it that way, for the West to arrive at this idea. And again, I'm not comparing East and West. I'm just saying that in modern Western psychology and philosophy and neuroscience, it took them a really long time to get this point, that consciousness is something other than its objects. It took them a really long time to understand that dreams and thoughts and emotions and memories are not consciousness. They're just another kind of object. Consciousness is that to which those objects appear. This definition is given by one of Shankara's disciples, Padmapada. He says, consciousness is anidam chaitanyam. The definition of consciousness is not this. What consciousness is the one to whom the this appears. So when you can say this, immediately you know that is not consciousness. Consciousness is the one that's pointing to it. But consciousness is anidam. It's not a this. Consciousness is me. And I am not an it. I am not a this. This appears to me. And what am I? Consciousness. I am essentially consciousness. And so consciousness is not correlated or caused, not correlated to the brain and not caused by the brain. So this is called the hard problem of consciousness. Materialists, if they're going to be honest, just cannot explain this view that they have, that the brain produces consciousness. It's an unfeasible position. There's no actual evidence for it. Although there's plenty of evidence for the correlation between the brain and the personality, or the brain and the subjective, subtle experience, there is no, as yet, any evidence for brain and consciousness. Right? So that's how we deal with materialism. Sāmkhya departs from materialism. It agrees with materialism on prakriti, everything that has to do with prakriti. Prakriti matter is inert, all of that Sāmkhya agrees, no problem. Where Sāmkhya steps away from evolutionary materialism is this. It asserts that the self is consciousness, and it asserts that consciousness is separate from the objects of consciousness. So every kind of object that you can experience is called prakriti. And these objects can be divided into two categories: the physical objects and the subtle objects. The physical objects are sensations that you can have of the world, like the bhutas, mahabhutas or panchabhutas, earth, water, fire, air, space. But there's also subtle sensations that you can have, namely thoughts, dreams, memories, but they're too a kind of object, a kind of matter, if you will. So in Sāmkhya, we have this idea of physical matter and subtle matter. Now, Descartes, he was confused about the mind and the body. He couldn't understand how the mind and body were related. So this is called Cartesian dualism. So Descartes proposed a basic duality of body and mind, a world of extension and a world of thought. And he proposed that they're kind of like oil and water. So Western Sāmkhya, if you will, is like the duality of mind and body. But Eastern Sāmkhya is the duality of subject and object. Here, the subject is seen as distinct from the mind. Isn't that a beautiful idea? That's new. In Sāmkhya, that's the new idea that's offered, that's not there in materialism or Cartesian duality. It's not there in evolutionary theories or anything. This idea that the self, consciousness, is the reality that's other than the mind and body. And the mind and body are a hyphen here. Mind is subtle experience, body is physical experience, and the two of them together can just be called the experienced, the object, prakriti. And I, the experiencer, am Purusha. I am the self. I am the walrus, kukukachu. So now we have this idea. It's called Sāmkhya. And Sāmkhya is a beautiful metaphysic because Purusha, the self, is inherently self-evident. After all, Descartes even realized this. He realized that the one thing he could not doubt is the existence of the doubter. To doubt yourself is to prove yourself. If you ask, do I exist? There you go. There's proof. You at least exist as the doubter. You exist as the thinking self, and you exist as the one who is not thinking also. So you cannot doubt your own existence as consciousness. It's immediately available to you. It's self-luminous, it's self-evident. So Sāmkhya starts with this. You can't deny that you are. For to deny that you are, and even Shankara in one place says, how can you deny the self? For the self is the one who entertains such a doubt. The self is the doubter. He phrases it very nicely in the Sanskrit. I'm mangling it in the English. But basically he's saying something that Descartes would say hundreds of years later. The idea is that to doubt the self is to prove the self. The self is the self of the one who doubts the self. Like that. So Sāmkhya, arguably the earliest cosmological and metaphysical system of India, made this point. Obviously I exist. Duh. But now what am I? What is it to exist? To exist is to be conscious. I am because I know that I am, and because I know, therefore I am. So this tautology of existence and consciousness is very important. Consciousness is existence, and existence is consciousness. And what am I conscious of? Well, that's where Sāmkhya starts. So the word Sāmkhya means to count, and the counting here is just a list of all the things that I'm aware of. So I'm aware of the intellect, I'm aware of the mind, I'm aware of the ego, I'm aware of my 5 organs of perception, the nose, the tongue, the eyes, the skin, the ears. I'm aware of my organs of action, the feet and the hands and the anus and the genitals and the mouth. I'm aware of subtle sensations, thoughts, emotions, etc., which appear in the mind. I'm at every moment smelling and tasting, or at most moments I'm smelling and tasting and seeing and touching and hearing. And what am I smelling and tasting and seeing and touching and hearing? A physical world. So all of this together, the physical world, the act of sensing it, the instruments through which it is sensed, the inner instruments, the antakarana, meaning the mind with all of its thoughts and memories and dreams, the discerning faculty known as the intellect, and even the ego. Even the ego. All of these things are on the side of Prakriti. They are on the side of the object. And I am Purusha. I am on the side of the subject. Notice what's happened here. Ahankara, the ego, is made into an object. Do you see? And aren't you aware of your self, in a sense? In other words, you're aware of that entity who is the knower and experiencer and doer. In other words, the agent of cognition and action. That's called the ahankara. So remember, the rule of Sāmkhya is if I'm aware of it, I am not it. In other words, if I can count it, if I can point to it, if I can label it, I am therefore something other than it. Is that fair? That's why the word Sāmkhya means to count. So you can practice Sāmkhya just by attending to your experience and through neti, through negation, intuiting what you are by a process of elimination. Am I the world? No. I'm aware of the world. I can see it. I can point to it. Am I the body? No. How can I be the body? I think I'm the body, but that's nonsense. I'm aware of the body. The body is an object to me. Am I the mind? No, I can't be the mind because I'm aware of thoughts and emotions and sensations. Whose mind? I'm just aware of it. And this is where it gets really interesting. Am I aware of myself? Yes. I'm aware of the ego. I'm aware of the sense of self. So I'm not even that. That's where people get stuck. It's a very subtle point. I am not the ego because the ego is an object to me. I'm aware of Nishant. I'm aware of his Instagram profile, and I'm aware of the fact that he's smelling and tasting and seeing. But what am I? Not the one talking right now. The one who is aware of that. So Purusha is a very beautiful idea. It's primordial consciousness. It's the true subject, not the ego, which Advaita Vedanta will call the reflected subject. The ego is merely like, dare I say, a projection of the Purusha, though this isn't quite Sāmkhyan in nature. But you can think of the ego as like a device that the Purusha uses in order to interface with Prakriti, in a sense. You know, that's why it's ahankara. It's like the maker of the I. It's a fabricated I. The very word seems to imply a sense of fabrication. So as long as there's something to be known, therefore I will need a knower. That knower is called the ahankara, if you will. But the real knower, which arguably is perceived only in samadhi, truly, from the yogic point of view, that real knower, which in Advaitic sense can be intuited in a moment of silence and stillness. And the Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra is all about cultivating that sense of silence and stillness after all. That real knower is called Purusha. And this is where Sāmkhya says there are as many Purushas as there are people in the world. So Sāmkhya is a dualistic tradition, yes, because Purusha is separate from Prakriti, but it's also a pluralistic tradition in that it suggests a plurality of selves. See, Sāmkhya doesn't say the ego is the self. No, ego is an object. It cannot be the self. The self is the subject. So Sāmkhya says Purusha is the self, but there are many Purushas. So Sāmkhya is a pluralistic system because it proposes a plurality of self. Look, the Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra verse 100 immediately rejects this. It says, Vishesho nasti kutrachit. There is no special, distinct self anywhere. There's only one Purusha. There are not many Purushas. And Sāmkhya will disagree here. Sāmkhya says, no, that's ridiculous. There's only one Purusha. And they'll give arguments like this. They'll say, you see, when you become enlightened, I stay bound. When you fall asleep, I'm awake. When I'm asleep, you're awake. So how then can there be the same self? Also, your point of view is your point of view and my point of view is my point of view. Since we all have different points of views, there's no way in which we can all be the same person. Does anybody want to argue against this? So what's the problem with this argument? You've heard it before. I'm just for fun. Does anybody want to offer a counter argument? The argument is this. So there are some, let's say 20 people here. The argument is there are 20 selves. Why are there 20 selves? Well, because there are 20 points of view. If Mohindra Deva becomes enlightened as a result of studying the Vijñāna-Bhairava, poor Nishant still will remain bound. So how then can we all be the same self? Because when some of you are enlightened, some of you are not. When some of you are asleep, some of you are awake. And we all have our unique vantage points. So we are therefore, all of us, obviously, separate selves. No? How do you respond to this? Are we all separate selves? Do you buy this argument? Does it sound fair to you? That's also a valid take. Or is there some sense that you have that maybe there's one self? How do you argue against the idea of separate selves? Anyone? So Viranatha is saying, just because something is in perception doesn't mean it's not in consciousness. That's exactly right. So in one sense, I'm perceiving some things, right? And you're perceiving some other things. But just because it's not there in my perception doesn't mean it's not there in consciousness. So in a sense, we're all perceiving the same thing. But you still can't deny that there are different sets of perceivables. I'm perceiving X, Scott G is perceiving Y. And Z is the thing that I don't perceive and Scott doesn't perceive. Then Z is in consciousness. But X is in my consciousness and Y is in Scott's consciousness. Yeah, exactly. So all the parts are in consciousness. That's good. Because the important point to point out here is that if something is not in perception, it's still in consciousness as the unperceived or unperceivable. And if something is not in knowledge, it's still in consciousness as the unknown or the unknowable. So in a sense, all the things that are and aren't are in consciousness, including each of these separate perspectives. That's one way to put it. Very beautiful. Another argument is, where does enlightenment happen? Another question to ask. Does it happen in the Purusha? Is that where you get enlightened? Is the Purusha bound? No. It is in the mind where enlightenment and bondage occur. So when a person is enlightened, it's their mind which is enlightened, and the mind is an object. When a person is unenlightened, it is their mind which is unenlightened, and the mind is an object. The self is neither enlightened nor in bondage. The self perceives both enlightenment and bondage. So the difference between an enlightened person and a bound person is not in essence. It's not in the self. It's in the mind. So there are many minds, but that doesn't mean there are many selves. There are obviously many bodies, And there are obviously many minds, but that doesn't mean there are many selves. The problem here is that Sāmkhya conflates the experience with the experiencer yet again, just like how modern materialism does, in a sense. The reason it proposes different selves is because each self has a unique vantage point. In other words, a unique experience. But a difference in the content of the experience is not a difference in the experiencer. Isn't that beautiful? Thrilling, right? This argumentation is thrilling. So this is how we do Shakta-upaya. We're reasoning. So at this point, you should already be convinced. How many people are there in this room? And by people, I mean, how many bodies are there in this room? A person is some body. You know how we use that language? Meaning each body per head. You know how they say? How many people will come to your retreat? Per head. You know, so they're literally counting bodies. How many bodies are in this room? Well, about 20. 21, they're around there. How many minds are in this room? In other words, I'm asking again, how many persons are in this room? How many people are here? Again, about 21, right? Like about 20 or 21 like that. So this is an important idea. There are actually 21 people here, insofar as we're defining people as the body, mind, ego complex, right? A person is the conjunct of ego, mind, and body. But now the real question is, how many consciousnesses are here? You'll see that, yes, exactly, Scotchy, the word consciousnesses is ridiculous. There is no plural here. There is only one consciousness. And in that one consciousness, there are different people. Yeah, and Mohindra Deva is offering a complex idea here. It's called Abhasavada. Different perspectives are all different perspectives of the same thing. So when we share our perspectives, it helps us comprehend something to which all our perspectives are attributed. You know, so it's almost like there is reality and God is looking at it from various different angles, and we're each so many pairs of eyes through which the one consciousness is experiencing a complex reality. Anyway, that's a deep and profound idea. It's called Abhasavada. Or we're like co-creating. Each of us, with our unique perspective, is co-creating reality with everyone else, whose perspective is combining with ours to create some abstract hyper-reality, if you will. Okay, so thus far, we know that Sāmkhya makes the mistake of conflating Purusha with mind. Obviously, minds are different. Obviously, bodies are different. But consciousnesses are not different. One more thing. Is the Purusha in time or is it transcendent to time? It's another question worth asking. Purusha here means consciousness. And we've already established that there's one consciousness. But here's another way to establish the oneness of consciousness, the non-duality of consciousness. Is there consciousness in time, or is there time in consciousness? It's a deep question. Is consciousness in time? It's the second one, right? No, consciousness is not in time. Consciousness is aware of time. So in this sense, consciousness transcends time because time is an object to consciousness. See, time is an inert object. In fact, it's a compound. Time is past plus present plus future. If it's a compound, if it's inert, it must therefore be an object. See, I mean, that's very complex Siddhanta metaphysics. In Siddhanta, they say if something is a compound, it therefore had a start and it has an end. Therefore, it's, transitory, it's ephemeral. And if it's inert, it's also ephemeral. There's only one thing that's not a compound, consciousness, and therefore it's eternal. And there's only one thing that's not insentient, consciousness, and also God, who is a special kind of consciousness, to use the Nyaya or Vaisheshika turn of phrase. Okay, here's what we have. Consciousness is not in time. Next question, is consciousness in space? No, space is an object. Consciousness is aware of time and it's aware of space. And what is space? It's also a compound in a sense. It's here plus there plus everywhere. So it's insentient, space is insentient, and it's kind of a compound in one sense also. So no, consciousness is not in time, nor is it in space. Time and space are objects. The next question to ask is, does consciousness have a form? What do you think? What's the form of consciousness? There's actually a super deep answer to this in the Advaitic non-dual Tantrik tradition, but I'm just going to go for a more mundane answer. Yeah, it doesn't have a form. You know, because actually the deep answer is it does have a form. You want to see? You want to see the form of consciousness? Are you ready? This. Consciousness looks like this. All this is consciousness. This is what consciousness looks like. It's nirakara, formless, in that it's sarvakara. But anyway, I don't want to go there. That's more profound than it needs to be right now. Right now, it's enough to say it doesn't have a form. Why not? Why doesn't consciousness have a form? What do you think? What makes it formless, anyway? We know that space is an object. We know that time is an object. So consciousness is transcendent to space and time. But does it have a form? And if so, what kind of form? Perhaps, but let's say it had this power, right, to create a form. The form that it creates aren't it. And yes, that's it, Lala. Forms are objects in consciousness. So even if it had the Shakti to create a form, the form that it creates will be an object to it, you see. So it can never be a form, because the moment it becomes a form, it then becomes subject to perception or subject to conception or subject to awareness. And if it's now an object to the subject, it's therefore not consciousness anymore, it's Prakriti. So all forms are Prakriti. Consciousness therefore is not a form. It's the one that perceives all forms. So look what we got here, fam. We've got consciousness, which is not in time, it's not in space, and it's formless. Now, in what way can you separate one consciousness from another consciousness? In no way. Because the only way you can separate one thing from another is through time, space, and form. Things are either different in terms of form, or they're different because they might have the same form, but they're different because they're in different places. Or they might be the same form in the same place, but they're different in that they were there at different times. So let's say there's Scott Wilson, okay? And there's Vijñāna-Bhairava. They're both different in terms of form. They both look different, right? Like, and not only that, imagine they had the same form. Imagine Scott Wilson and Vijñāna-Bhairava had the exact same form. They would still be different, because one fella's in Albany and the other fella's in Texas. So they're different in terms of space, right? But imagine this. Imagine if Vijñāna-Bhairava and Scott Wilson both had the same form and they were in the same place. Could you then distinguish them? You could if they were there at different times. So you could say Scott Wilson was that form who was there in that place at T1, time 1. And Vijñāna-Bhairava was that form who was there in that place at T2. In that sense, I can call one Scott and I can call the other one Vijñāna-Bhairava. Do you see? I can still distinguish them in terms of time. But if Purusha is neither in time nor in space, and if it does not have a form, in no sense can I distinguish one Purusha from another. So these are all arguments against Sāmkhyan pluralism. Right? There are no multiple selves. There is no plurality of Purushas. Therefore, it says, Vishesho nasti kutrachit. There is nowhere existing a special self, a discrete self. There is only one consciousness, and it's all pervasive. Tanmayam sarvam. It's vyaptita. It's all pervasive. Wow, isn't that so beautiful? So that's the first thing. So we've tackled materialism and its concept of consciousness emerging from matter, which is very hard to buy. But we've also tackled Sāmkhya and its ideas of multiple selves. Now, let's look at the self itself. And here I want to talk a little bit about Shaiva Siddhānta. So in Shaiva Siddhānta, the idea is that the self is discrete. And each person is a discrete self. And each of these selves is dependent on Shiva, who is a special kind of self, a supreme self, an oversoul, if you will. So it's a kind of bheda, but it's also importantly a kind of bheda. There's a distinction between Shiva and me, but it's not quite so clear what the categorical distinction is between Shiva and me. I might be a part of Shiva, or I might be separate from Shiva, but dependent on Shiva. But the fact is, I am a discrete individual self. So in the Shaiva Siddhānta, we find arguments very much like we find in Sāmkhya, very much like we find in Nyaya, very much like we find in Vaisheshika, very much like we find in Mimamsa. Basically, the arguments all point to the existence of a self. The self, whether it's one self in all beings or one self each in one individual being, one by one, like whatever it might be, we have to first establish the self. And the reason we have to do this is because of the Buddhist challenge. So now let's come to Buddhism. Now Buddhism offers a very strong critique of the self. They give this metaphor, the mossy rock. Let's say we see a rock covered in moss and we think, there's a rock covered in moss. But wait, we have never actually seen the rock. The rock is after all covered in moss. It's possible that there is no rock beneath the moss. We just assume that there is a rock. We infer the presence of a rock because we see the moss in a particular shape. But what if, upon poking the moss, you realize it's just a hollow circle of moss? This happened to me one time. Somebody bought for me this chocolate bunny. It was Vijaya. Vijay bought for me a chocolate bunny. It was like an Easter bunny, you know. And so I didn't know very much about like American candies and stuff like that. So I didn't really know what to expect from this. It was like quite big. It was this big. Anyway, I got so excited because I was like, oh my God, this is a lot of chocolate, no? Like this is a solid block of bunny chocolate. And it had a certain weight to it also. Anyway, I undo the wrapping and I take this big bite out of the bunny's head. Like Ozzy Osbourne at the concert or whatever. I'm like, And then I'm shocked because it's hollow. There was no chocolate inside. It was just the... Yeah, I think, okay, maybe you have to do something. Okay, I didn't know that. Maybe you have to fill it with milk or fill it with sweets or something. But I thought it was chocolate all the way through. I thought it was a solid block of chocolate. It was natural for me to assume that because I saw the outside. But then the moment I bit into it, I realized it was hollow inside. It's like that with the self. It looks like a rock because it's covered with moss in the shape of a rock. But if you look closely, if you poke at the moss, if you bite the chocolate bunny, inside you'll see it's all space. It's all void. There is no rock. There is no bunny. Now, another example they give is the rusted axe. You see an axe and it's all covered with rust. Maybe there's no axe there. But I infer that there's an axe because the rust is in the shape of the axe. So, according to Buddhism, it's quite a natural mistake to make. The self is a natural mistake. I assume that there is something there because there is a bundle of things. The Panchaskandhas, there's some physicality and some mentality, some samskaras, some basic sense of consciousness. Like, you know, there are all these perceptions and sensations and conceptions, and they all seem to be accretized around a common center. So I quite naturally assume that this bundle, this mossy rock, contains some substance. But let's look closely. You look at the body, you see that it's not a thing per se. It's a series of discrete sensations appearing one after another. It's not a thing. The illusion of thingness arises from the fact that these sensations are occurring so quickly, so close to one another. Then when you look at the mind, you see the mind actually has no essence, reality either, because the mind is a series of discrete sensations. And because they are discrete flashes of consciousness, there is no continuous, eternal thing called consciousness. Therefore, it's just like spinning what do you call it? A stick of shalaka, deepa shalaka, firebrand. It's like wheeling a firebrand. It appears that there's a circle in the air. Fire wire. It's what do you call it? Like a stick with fire in the end, right? Firebrand, I think. Torch, called torch. So you whirl the torch like this. If you whirl it fast enough, you'll see a circle of flame. It's Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire, the 12-spoked wheel of fire meditation. But it looks like there's something there, right? But there isn't. There's just one point moving really quickly. And because it's moving so quickly, it gives the idea of a circle where there isn't actually a circle. I see. Okay, then another idea. This is even more profound. Say I have a fan with 3 blades and then it wheels about really quickly. Won't I see a single sheet of silver or a single sheet of metal? Just because of the speed of it. Now say I have a blue and red thread and I wheel it about really quickly. I might see purple, but there's no purple there. Now you've all had an experience of this, right? Like as kids you go to a natural science museum and there are optical illusions games. And sometimes you can like... Once a kid did this to me. I was in the library teaching a class and the kid made me sit in front of the library computer and he had me stare at a point in this YouTube video where everything was going and he made me stare at it for like, I don't know, 1 minute or something. And then he told me to look away. And then when I looked away, everything seemed to be going blue, blue, like you're on an acid trip or something like that. You know? So we all know what it's like to see something where there isn't anything. It's an optical illusion. And it comes through maybe patterns, interference pattern, like happening really quickly or something. So that's the Buddhist idea, that this body seems to be a thing. But if you meditate and look closely, if you pay attention with the right mindfulness, you'll see it's not a thing. It's a series of discrete flashes. This mind and its consciousness, Vijñāna, it seems to be a thing. But if you look closely, you'll see it's discrete flashes of consciousness. Therefore, there is no substantial, eternal, continuous self. It's just a bundle. And the Buddhists will say, if there's no object, there's no subject. So no object means no subject. So they're like bales of hay balancing on top of one another. So if there are no objects, you can't say there's a subject. And if there's no subject, you can't say there's an object. So they rise and fall together. Mutually dependent arising, you could say. And because of mutually dependent arising, since the world is seen as void, the self to which the world appears is also seen as void. Both are inherently empty. This is the Buddhist position. Any takers? It's pretty good. I mean, I kind of like it. It's kind of nice, deep, and beautiful, and profound, and very helpful. It's a very helpful idea. Exactly. So now let's debate a little bit, right? What's wrong with this view? I mean, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind? How would you debate the idea that there is no self? Any takers? Any first thoughts here? First pass at refuting the Buddhist? It's really not that hard. That's the thing. It's like Buddhist philosophy develops a lot, and it's very complex, and the Nyaya is very, very complex here. But I think the arguments are quite intuitive. Although, like, Navya Nyaya can be, like, super complicated, and the debates between the Advaita Vedantins, the Nyayas, Vaisheshikas, like, yeah, exactly. Sarvamangala has given one answer here. So we'll start with this. The Buddha had a realization, right? And the realization was that there is no self. To whom did that realization occur? That's an important point. Buddhism is a realization. It's not nihilism. Nagarjuna specifies this in his Mula Madhyamaka Karika. He's like, the Buddha did teach an absolute reality. It's not nihilism. He's not saying there's no self, there's no mind, therefore there's nothing. There is the realization of Anatman. And that Anatman realization is realized by someone, no? By some being. That being is called the Buddha. The Buddha is one who realizes the inherent emptiness of mind and body and world. So having emptied out the Panchaskandhas, the 5 aggregates of self, having emptied out the world of self, Chitta Matra, having emptied out even the mind, Chitta itself, of self, Madhyamika, eventually we have a realization. What it is we cannot say, but it's there. And Nagarjuna in his Sanskrit Mula Madhyamaka Karika points this, it's absolute, it's an absolute reality. Buddha is not teaching nihilism, but that absolute reality, you just can't say what it is. But that's what we call the self, you see. So that reality, the one to whom the realization of not self occurred, that's the self. Now another argument, and Sarvamangala has offered it here. This is a beautiful argument actually, because it takes the best version of the Vijñāna-Vada argument. So let me just get a whiteboard up now. Wait, how do I get the whiteboard? More. They've moved things around a little bit, so now it's harder to find. Okay, here we go. A new whiteboard. So let's say, here's the Buddhist argument, the textbook Buddhist argument. It's a very beautiful argument, and it goes like this. So, what should I use? Let's use the highlighter. So, like, let's say there's an event. Wait, no. Oh, how do I get rid of this guy now? Never mind. Oh, here it is. Okay. So let's say there's some object, right? And we'll say this is object number 1. Now, mutually dependent arising, object 1 is always connected to consciousness 1. So consciousness 1 exists only as long as object 1 exists, and object 1 exists only as long as consciousness 1 exists. So let's call this T. Object 1, the taste of tea. Consciousness 1, the one who tasted the tea. Good night, Kleshwari. Jaima. Okay, that's object 1, consciousness 1. Now, second object, object 2. Going with the gustatory sense here, the taste of water. Copper water. Actually, it was empty. So the experience of the copper water bottle being empty, that's object 2. And here's consciousness 2. Okay. And then object number 3, the experience of seeing some fool struggle to write on a whiteboard. So here's object 3, and here's consciousness 3. Okay, so these are mutually codependent arisings. O3, C3, O2, C2, O1, C1. Okay, now they're all discrete from one another. So this is discrete, this is discrete, this is discrete, and this is discrete. So there are these gaps, right? There are these gaps between objects, and there are gaps between consciousness. Therefore, there is no one thing called consciousness. They are discrete flashes of consciousness. There is no thing called the world. It's discrete flashes of sensations. The obvious response here is, so you're saying that there is a gap between C1 and C2, C2 and C3? Yes. How do you know that? How are you aware of the gap? In other words, how are you able to mind the gap? Here's the gap. You were aware of it. So you were aware of C1, C2, and C3, but you're also aware of gap 1, gap 2, and gap 3. That must mean that C1, along with the gap, C2 along with the gap, and C3 are all contained in some over soul or some over consciousness. That's what we're talking about. So you're right. This might be empty, right? Like you can empty all this, no problem. We have no problem with that whatsoever. But you cannot empty this. For this is the one that recognizes the emptiness. So you can call this the void, right? Here's the void, no problem. But you cannot deny the clear light of the void. So the clear light of the void shines through the void and it perceives the void. Here's my artwork. It's selling in the Guggenheim, maybe. So, let me get rid of this whiteboard now. Okay, so that's the argument against Vijñāna-Vada. They're discrete flashes of consciousness, but you're, as Sarvamangala pointed out, also aware of the gap between those discrete flashes. Therefore, the one to whom emptiness occurred is the self. So that's some version of the argument. Now, in a very beautiful Shaiva Siddhānta text, it's called Shiva Jnana Bodha, and these are all words that are synonyms. Shiva, Jnana, Bodha. Shiva is consciousness, Jnana is knowledge, Bodha is awareness. So Shiva Jnana Bodha is a funny text because the very title implies the trika. You know, all these three are actually three in one, but I don't need to go there right now. In verse 3, there's a very beautiful proof for the self that's given. It goes like this. Netito mamato drekad aksho parati bodhataha swape nirbhogato bodhe bodhrivat asti anutanao asti anustanao. So from the Shiva Jnana Bodha, the argument is, since there is an agent of negation, since there is a one in whom arises the feeling of mindness, since there is a one who perceives through the senses, since there is a one who dreams, and since there is a one who is there in deep sleep in the absence of all experience, there is therefore the self in the body. And asti means there is, anu means self or individual consciousness, and tanuhu means body, so tanao. So Astyanu stanao means there is a self in the body. The very fact that this text feels like it needs to assert the existence of the self in the body is clearly because of the Buddhist challenge. So when this text was composed, it was a response to the Buddhism of the time, you know, and the response is as follows. There is obviously a self because, and one of the most powerful arguments that they use here is the deep sleep argument. See, the Buddhist claim is that it's mutually dependent arising. There must be some object for there to be consciousness. If there is not an object, there won't be consciousness. Then explain deep sleep. In deep sleep, there is no object whatsoever. And yet, and you can't even say the void is an object because it's not like you're there experiencing the void. And by the way, if the void is an object, you're in trouble. Because then Buddhism will fall into the category of eternalism, which is trying to avoid, right? So the void cannot be a no thing. The void is nothing. If it becomes a no thing, then it's already something. Because a no thing is something other than all the things that you are familiar with. But it's a thing. Or it's an object or something, you know. Or you're just calling it no thing. You're doing some kind of hand waving. You're like, it's nothing, but it's not nothing. It's something, but it's not something. It's a no thing. Hare, you've asserted the positive existence of nothing. So it's something. Anyway, the void isn't like that. Because if it were an object, then it would be a something. So it's not like in deep sleep you're actually aware of the void. The void is not something that you are aware of. You are rather aware of the lack of all experiences. Haven't you noticed in deep sleep you're not like consciously there experiencing the void? I mean, that would be maybe samadhi or something. But in deep sleep, you just experience nothing, and yet you can't deny that you experience nothing. So when you wake up, you say, oh, I had no dreams, or I slept deeply. The very fact that all the languages in the world have some concept for deep sleep. Look, if there really was no experience there, we couldn't be speaking about it now. There wouldn't be this word deep sleep. You would only have the word sleep and dream, right? That's it. And it's not like you immediately, oh, I slept deeply, so I must have forgotten my dreams. No. Usually we slept deeply means, when we say we slept deeply, it doesn't necessarily imply I dreamt and forgot about it. It somehow implies that I just didn't have any dreams. And people say that, deep, dreamless sleep. Well, how do you know you had no dreams, Baba? Because you were there, even in the absence of all experience. So this concept, nirbhogato, bodhe bodhrivat, even when there is nirbhoga, bhoga here means any kind of experience whatsoever, any kind of object. In the absence of all objects, nirbhoga, bodhe bodhrivat, there was still some awareness. Who was there in dream? Somebody was there experiencing the dream, somebody was there experiencing deep sleep, and somebody is here now experiencing through all these senses. And then, of course, there is somebody in whom arises the concept of mindness. That's another idea. And I think this is my favorite idea, netito. If you negate the self, if you doubt the self, that itself proves the self. So netito, there must be some referent for negation. So if I'm going to negate something, I am negating it. You see, I can't self-reflexively negate myself. For to do that is to confirm the existence of at least the negator, as both Descartes and much before Descartes, Shankara pointed out. You see? So this is why the no-self argument doesn't really work, except it does, if we understand it properly. See, there's a difference between the teachings of the Buddha and the teachings of the Buddhist. Right? There is a difference between the teachings of Christ and, we all know, the followers of the Christ. Usually, those who come close at the heels of an avatar tend to mangle things up to hell, right? And part of that is because the avatar is so powerful that we are unfortunately liable to take his words, her words, its words, too literally. So part of the problem here is that Buddhism and Christianity and Hinduism have all mangled, perhaps in some sense, the teachings of the rishis, the teachings of Buddha, the teachings of Christ. It's not maybe the case, not necessarily the case, that Buddha was teaching metaphysics, right? Couldn't he have just been doing pedagogy? In other words, did the Buddha say there was no self because there was no self? Or did the Buddha simply say there was no self to help the individuals fascinated with the ego and with the eternal soul and with God and with priests to get rid of that conception? So it could be a teaching tool. It was useful in his time for his disciples. It doesn't necessarily mean he's metaphysically convinced that there is no self. There's a difference between pedagogy and ontology. So Buddhist ontology, unfortunately, might be based on pedagogy. In other words, they might have mistaken the means for the ends. And the means are powerful. If you can look at the body clearly and see that it's not a thing, your attachment to it will go away. If you can look closely at your ego and see that it's not really a thing, your fear, your desire will go away. And then what are you? You are the awake one, the Buddha. And the Buddha means one who lives in awareness, consciousness, which is the self. That's the idea. So anyway, we can get into this. And there are many sophisticated arguments from the Buddhists. Of course, I'm not representing them as wholly and thoroughly as I could. And there's also very sophisticated arguments from the Advaita Vedantins and the Nyayikas and the Vaisheshikas and the Mimamsikas. And I think for the most part, the Buddhists kind of beat the Nyayikas, Vaisheshikas, and Mimamsikas. They have a harder time beating the Advaita Vedantins. But also, it's easy to say the Advaita Vedantins are just crypto-Buddhists. So again, there's not really that much difference between Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, except in maybe the most ultimate reality, which is the Advaita Vedantins claim that there is a Brahman, the Buddhists say that there isn't. But again, their methodologies, the Jedi and the Sith are almost the same in every single way, right? Chancellor Palpatine tells Anakin in episode 3. Anyway, we don't need to get into this like Advaita Vedanta Buddhism debate. Essentially, they're the same, I think. Essentially, they're saying the same thing using different words. The Advaita Vedantins are not eternalists, as the Buddhists accuse them of being. And nor are the Buddhists nihilists, as the Advaita Vedantins are accusing them of being. They're both actually saying the exact same thing in slightly different language. Okay, having said all of that, our position is somewhat different. So here we've established the self, hopefully. Hopefully we've established the self. Now, what the Shaiva Siddhānta is going to say is the following. The self is different from the instruments, the way the king is different from the ministers. They're categorically different. The ministers are not the king the king is not the ministers. But the mantris, the ministers, are acting because of the king. So if there is no king, there are no ministers. The general, the minister, the officers, whoever is in the kingdom, the delegates, they're not going to be doing their job if there is no king to direct them. Similarly, the body and the instruments of the body, the prana, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the mind with its buddhi, ahankara, manas, all of those things require the self. Without the self, which is the king, they won't function. At the behest of the king, the self, they therefore function. That's the example that we're given. So the self is categorically distinct from the instruments. This is a Sāmkhyan idea through and through. Purusha, Prakriti, they're categorically distinct. They'll never be the same. But there, unlike Sāmkhya, is some relationship between them now. And so you see, Sāmkhya later adopts some idea like this. Purusha comes close to Prakriti, then only Prakriti starts to act. But until Purusha comes close, Prakriti won't act. Similarly, until the king orders, the action, the ministers won't do it. Ideally. Ideally. So categorically speaking, the minister is not the king and the king is not the minister, but the minister depends on the king and acts by command of the king or the queen or the royal person. So that's the first metaphor. Then the second metaphor the text gives us is that of the magnet and the metal, or the iron filings. So the magnet is Shiva, God, the Paramatman, Supreme Soul. And the iron filings are the Purushas, the individual souls. Right? So the magnet and the iron filings are different in that the magnet controls the iron filings. But wait, they're not categorically different. They're the same in a sense. In a sense, they're both metal. The only difference is that the magnet is metal that's been magnetized, and the iron filing is magnet that is not yet magnetized. It's metal that's not yet magnetized, but it can be magnetized. That's the idea. The minister can never be the king. And of course, if the minister kills the king and deposes the king and becomes the king, that's not quite what we're saying here. That won't work either, really, because the minister loses his ministerness and becomes a king. You see, so it's categorically distinct. But do you see how the magnet is still essentially metal, although it's metal endowed with a certain Shakti, magnetism. Whereas the iron filing is also metal, but it's metal without that Shakti. This is the only difference between God and the individual soul, according to Shaiva Tantra. Shakti. God has Shakti, omniscience and omnipotence. The individual soul, because of mala, to use the Shaiva Siddhānta, the dualistic language here, because of some kind of obscuration or impurity, which is here analogized to the chakshu patala, the film in the eye, like a person who has a cataract, like that. Because of this actual substantive defect, or rather obstruction, the soul doesn't experience omniscience and omnipotence. But if you rub, how do you make a magnet? You can pass electricity through it, right? Call that Shaktipata if you want. But how do you make a magnet? I think there's like a way to rub something and then it becomes magnetized. I don't know. I played truant in many of my physics classes when I was in high school and also in college. I wasn't really too interested. But yeah, you can expose, that's it, Viranatha. You can expose magnetic material to a magnet. So this is the idea. Through Diksha, initiation, through puja, through spiritual practices like japa, like contemplation, like meditation, you become exposed to God's grace, which is always there. God is the magnet, which is always magnetizing. But by becoming exposed more and more to that magnet, you become a magnet yourself. You become godlike. You gain, in a sense gain, but again, Shaiva Siddhānta doesn't like the idea of utpatti. It doesn't like the idea of suddenly gaining something you never had. More like your inherent magnetic qualities become activated. All the metal is inherently, inherently magnetic. It can be. It has the potential to be magnetic. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to make that divinity manifest. That's what Vivekananda said. So each piece of metal is inherently magnetic. It's potentially magnetic. It just needs to be rubbed the right way, like a genie in the bottle, like in that Christina Aguilera song or something. So you have to rub the piece of metal, and that's what tapas is, as Viranatha is saying. The more japa you do, the more tapas you do, the more you expose yourself to holy company and to spiritual spaces, the more the metal comes into the presence of magnetism, the more it will take on the qualities of magnetism. So unlike the king and the ministers, which is the relationship between the purusha and the instruments, meaning the ahankara, the mana, the buddhi, the jnanendriyas, the karmendriyas, I'm using Sanskrit phrases. Please, in the Q&A, if these phrases aren't quite clear, this is I think it's a pretty high level class in that it presupposes quite a lot of philosophical background. But I know also some of us might be new to this material. So, of course, in the Q&A, please feel free to ask any and all questions, especially regarding these terms. But I'm just very briefly now, I'm coming to the end of the class, very briefly. These pancha karmendriyas, pancha jnanendriyas, these antakarana kinds of things, manaha, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, all of these things are the ministers. And the purusha, the indwelling essence here, the jiva, the individual soul, is distinct from them categorically. Just like purusha is categorically distinct from prakriti, just like the king is categorically distinct from the ministers. However, unlike Sāmkhya, where purusha and prakriti don't really have anything to do with each other, here the king commands the ministers. So they depend on him. In the same way that he depends on God, but there's a difference here. The soul and God are qualitatively the same. They're both metal, but they are characteristically different, I guess, functionally different, because the metal has magnetism when it's a magnet, and the metal doesn't have magnetism when it's a regular piece of metal. In other words, the soul is God when it has omniscience and omnipotence, and the soul is bound when it doesn't have these things. That's Shaivism in a nutshell. Even dualistic Shaivism, this teaching of the ministers and the king and the metal and the magnet is all coming from verses 3, 4, and 5 of this dualistic Shaiva masterpiece, which of course can be interpreted non-dualistically also. Okay, the takeaway from all of this is that let us be God. Through japa, through grace, through puja, one can become a magnet themselves. That's the idea. Okay, now coming back to this verse, we can use all of those arguments that we just used against Sāmkhya. We could say, look, how can there be more than one selves? How can there be more than one consciousnesses? Can there really be spaces? I mean, can there really be divisions in the sky because there are 20 jars? Just because there are 20 jars in the room right now doesn't mean that there are 21 pockets of space. No, there's just space. There's no space in the jar. There are jars in space. Similarly, there are bodies and minds in consciousness. There is not consciousness in the body and mind. So look at the difference. In the verse that I just read to you, and by the way, it's in the Discord, so if you want to see that verse, if you go to the Discord, you'll see it. Oh, where is it? Oh, here it is, here it is. Netito mamato drekad, udrekad, a rising of mamata. Mamata udrekad, aksho paratibhodataha, swape nirbhogato bodhe bodhirvat astyanus tanao. Astyanus tanao. Sorry, there should be a dot under the N and a dot under the N. I didn't have a transliteration software for this, I just typed it. But astyanus tanao. There is the self in the body. Look, the whole difference is this. We're saying there is a self in the body. Asti, there is. Anu, a self, in the tanu, the body. So this is where you get the metaphor of the jars and space. Space only appears to be sankocha, contracted, when you put a jar there. Is it actually? And that's where we get one of my favorite demonstrations. Favorite because it allows me to sip my tea. So here's a cup. Okay, now there's a cup, and presumably there's space in the cup. So here I go. I'm going to move the cup. Okay, riddle me this. Have I moved the space in the cup? Here's the cup. I'm moving the cup. Have I moved the space in the cup? You know, if you're listening to this as an audio, right now I'm currently moving a cup across the Zoom screen. So, did I move space? Very deep question. No, I did not. Exactly. I did not move the space in the cup. The cup... Oh, sorry. I did not move space in the cup. I moved the cup in space. It's such a big reversal. Right? Exactly. So, not unless you count the cup inside space as categorically different. You know, so that's the thing. The cup is not... The cup is here, and the space in the cup and the space outside the cup can, as Vijñāna said, be described as categorically different. After all, the space in the cup is contracted. It's sankuchita. Whereas the space outside the cup is vikasa. It's expanded. So here's expanded space and here's contracted space. So Vijñāna is exactly right. In the dualistic Shaiva sense, or even in the qualified non-dual Shaiva sense, there is a kind of difference. Maybe not qualitative difference, but a kind of difference nonetheless. Not categorical, doesn't have to be categorical. They're both space, but different phases of space. One is space contracted, one is space expanded. So in Shaivism, the self expanded is Shiva, and Shiva contracted is the self. How about that? Shiva and Jiva are the same thing. Jiva with Vikasa, expansion, is Shiva. And Shiva with Sankocha, contraction, is Jiva. So I think Vijñāna is making a really deep point here. That in a sense, you can actually categorically say, okay, well, there's contracted space and expanded space. But they're not categorically distinct because they're both space in different phases of expansion and contraction. So that's a deep, I think, Shaiva notion of the self. It's about expansion and contraction. Unmesha and Nimesha. Good night, Vishnuji. And I'm just about to wrap up. I just one last thing to say. I think it's this. But actually, dare I say it, functionally and qualitatively, it's not that there's space in the cup. In fact, if I break the cup, have I released the space? In a manner of speaking. But the space in the cup is unaffected by the cup, actually. It's not that I'm moving the space in the cup, I'm moving the cup in the space. This is the difference between the non-dual Shaiva view and the dualistic Shaiva view. The dualistic Shaiva view says there is a self, thus differing with the Buddhist and whatnot. But their concept of the self is also very deep because it's like a magnet that can also be a piece of metal that can also be magnetized through sadhanas and grace and whatnot. That's a very radical idea. But I think more importantly right now for this verse that we're studying, the new notion of self that we're trying to articulate is not a self that's in the body. It's a self in which all bodies come and go. So let's see how to practice this in a kind of Shambhava Upaya way. So now I'm going to suggest something that's a bit like Bhairavi Mudra or Shambhavi Mudra. It's a bit like this. So right now, I feel like I'm in the body. Nothing could be further from the truth. Look carefully and see that the body is an experience in you. Just try it and see. Are you aware of smells? Yes, I can smell some things. I can taste some things also in the mouth. I can see. I'm seeing all sorts of things. And also I can touch and I can hear. Okay, now, what is the body if not just a series of sensations? And where are those sensations happening if not in consciousness? So am I in the body? No. Right now I can prove it. The body is an experience arising and dissolving in consciousness. So therefore, it's ridiculous to propose that you've had an out-of-body experience. How could you have had an out-of-body experience? That implies that you were in the body in the first place. You're not. You had different experiences of embodiment. But at no point did you step out of the body, because at no point were you in the body. Rather, the body is this complex and beautiful myriad of sensations that comes and goes. Okay, that's established. But now notice what we feel. We feel like more this body than other bodies. So if you look around, if you look at the Zoom screen, you'll see some other bodies, right? You don't feel as much that body as you feel this body. Isn't that the case? So I feel this body, yes. I cannot deny, I absolutely cannot deny that the body is an experience arising in consciousness. However, as much as I can concede to that, I cannot concede that I am the one consciousness in all bodies. Because this body, even though it's an arising in me, feels way more intimate, way more personal, way more intense than all the other bodies arising in other consciousnesses maybe, right? So that's why I think it's very intuitive to say, okay, well, there's one consciousness attributed to this body, and there's another consciousness attributed to that body. Because I'm here, and you're there. Here comes the clincher, the profound teaching. It's almost a Mahavakya. Here and there are both in consciousness. This is the idea. Here, I'm experiencing this body. There, I'm experiencing that body. Okay, I can say I'm more intensely experiencing this body, I'm less intensely experiencing that body. Degrees of intensity aside, this and that, here and there, are they both not concepts in space? And isn't space itself an experience in consciousness? And more importantly, how do I know that my intense experience of the body is not just a fact of conditioning? I've just been conditioned to see this body and mind as mine, therefore I feel more intimately associated to it. But what if right now I could just step back from all of that? What if for a moment I could feel myself as all bodies? After all, aren't all bodies appearing in consciousness? And aren't I fundamentally, essentially consciousness? So the way to practice this, verse 100 in Vijñāna-Bhairava Tantra, can be as follows. With eyes open, just perceive the world around you. And inwardly notice that you are as much there as you are here. Just stay with that thought for a while. That table over there, or that book over there, or whatever it is on the other side of the room for you. That is as much consciousness, is as much you as this body and this mind. Why? Because that is as much an object to you as this body and this mind. So now the claim here is Purusha and Prakriti are separate? No. Actually, Purusha is separate from Prakriti, but Prakriti is not separate from Purusha. The gold is other than the ornaments, but the golden ornaments are not other than gold. The ocean is other than the wave, but the wave is not other than the ocean. So I, consciousness, am other than the world, but the world is not other to consciousness. After all, if it were, who would be there to verify it? And that's where we go back to Viranatha's argument earlier, where it's like, maybe it's not in my perception, but it's still in consciousness, as the unperceived. Maybe it's not in my knowledge, but it's still in consciousness, as the unknown. Having said that, I'm not making a solipsistic case for the world being only what you can see and what you know in this moment. No, obviously the world is much more than what you can see in this moment. It's much more than what you can know. We can only see and know such a small portion of the world. But that doesn't mean the world is outside of you. It exists in you, actually. as raw potential, as the unknown, the unknowable, the unseen, the unseeable. All of that is still in consciousness. So right now, you can practice it with what you can see and what you do know. Within the range of the seen, there is no scope for the other. There is no room for out there. When have you ever seen anything out there? Every single thing you have ever seen and experienced is in here. It's you. That's the idea. So putting this together then, Chiddharma sarva deheshu. There is only one reality in all bodies, for all bodies are actually in it. There is no special consciousness anywhere. And thus, a person who contemplates that the entire world is pervaded by that reality called consciousness verily transcends the world. Okay, so one more thing, I guess. When you look at someone's eyes, another way to practice this is feel yourself there looking at you through their eyes also. That's another way to practice this. Know me alone to be the knower in all beings, O Arjuna. Shri Krishna describes the Kshetra, the field, and the Kshetragyas, the knowers of the field. And he is both the field, Prakriti, and the knowers, Purusha. So this Bhagavad Gita verse is saying Krishna is the sum total of all Purushas, and he is Prakriti also, the one which the Purushas are all experiencing. So that being said, behind every person, you know how they say, there's like that old kind of like 50s claim, behind every successful man is a strong woman. And then people make jokes about it. Behind every successful man is a strong woman, and behind that woman is somebody checking them out. You could say, behind every successful man is a strong woman, and behind every strong woman is Purusha. And behind every Purusha is, you say, behind every Purusha is consciousness. Like that. That's the claim. So behind every Kshetragya, knower, is Kshetra, the supreme Kshetragya, Parama Kshetragya, which is Krishna. And so Krishna just means consciousness here. And so we're saying that reality called God is that one whose essence is consciousness. And you can't deny that's what you are. So you, consciousness, are the one reality. You in here, in all bodies, you are all pervasively present. And by contemplating this, you transcend all birth and death and rebirth. By contemplating this, you become the conqueror of the world. You become free. You become Shiva himself, itself. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu. Jai Thakur. Jai Thakur. Okay, so we'll take some questions now. So hopefully you can see how Atman, Paramatman, that is to say Purusha and the Vishesh Purusha or the Supreme Purusha, as in the yoga philosophy. Ahankara, Purusha. So Ahankara, ego, is not Purusha, subject. And Purusha, subject, is not Bhagavan, who is the sum total of all Purushas. You are actually Bhagavan. You are actually Shiva, who is the knower of all Purushas. So hopefully by now, we can have a clear distinction between Ahankara, Purusha, and Shiva. In fact, what we call Jiva is some in between the Purusha and the Ahankara. I think Jiva is best used to imply some kind of Ahankara, actually, some kind of entity. It's very hard. Sāmkhya struggles a lot to try to understand what Jiva is. But by the word Pashu, we just mean Purusha. And Purusha is the king. Its instruments, including egoity, are the ministers. And that Purusha is separate from Shiva because Shiva is the metal with magnetizing power, and we are the iron filings being moved by that magnet. But because of that magnetic influence, one day we too might become magnets unto ourselves. We might become Shiva, for we have that inherent potential within us already. Okay. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Jai Ma. Okay.